My sister Rachel refused to visit me in the hospital because she said I was too depressing and would ruin her mood. She was too busy with her perfect life to care about mine falling apart. But what she didn't know was that I was documenting everything. And when I got out, I made sure her perfect world came crashing down in the most public way possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never thought I'd wake up in a hospital bed staring at fluorescent lights that hummed too loud and made everything look sickly yellow. The smell hit me first, that antiseptic mixture of bleach and sadness that hospitals seem to specialize in. My back felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my spine, which wasn't far from the truth considering the 18-wheeler that had slammed into my Honda Civic 3 days earlier. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive, but lying there with metal rods holding my spine together and facing months of physical therapy, lucky wasn't exactly the word I would have chosen. Dr. Amanda Chen, my surgeon, had been brutally honest about my recovery. 6 months minimum before I could even think about returning to my classroom. 6 months of learning to walk again, of depending on others, of being vulnerable in ways I'd never experienced before. That's when I reached for my phone with shaking hands and called Rachel, my sister, my only sibling, the person who had always been there through everything. We'd grown up in the same house in Phoenix, shared the same childhood memories, fought over the same toys. She was only 2 years older than me, but she'd always acted like my protector. When our mom died 5 years ago, we'd promised each other we'd always be there for each other. Family first, we'd said. Always family first. Rachel answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful like it always was. She was probably at her marketing firm downtown, the one where she'd climbed the corporate ladder faster than anyone expected. She'd always been ambitious, always driven, always focused on success in a way that both impressed and intimidated me. While I'd chosen teaching because I loved working with kids, Rachel had chosen marketing because she loved winning. When I told her what had happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she started asking practical questions. Was I okay? Obviously not, I wanted to say, but I bit my tongue. Did I have insurance? Yes, thank God. Did I need her to call anyone? Maybe, I said, thinking of my principal and my students who would be wondering where I was. But when I asked her to come see me, to just sit with me for a while because I was scared and alone and everything hurt, her tone changed completely. She got that careful, measured voice she used when she was about to deliver bad news to a client. Sarah, she said, I wish I could, but you know how crazy things are at work right now. We're launching the Henderson campaign next week, and I'm practically living at the office. I understood work pressure, I really did. But this was different. This was family. This was me lying in a hospital bed, wondering if I'd ever walk normally again. But Rachel kept talking about deadlines and presentations and client meetings like they were more important than the fact that her sister had nearly died. Then came the words that would replay in my mind for months afterward. Look, Sarah, I know this is hard, but hospitals just really depress me. All that sadness and sickness, it brings down my energy, and I need to stay positive right now. You know how sensitive I am to negative environments. Maybe once you're out and feeling better, we can get together for lunch or something. I hung up the phone feeling more alone than I had when I first woke up. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional punch of realizing that my own sister considered my suffering an inconvenience to her mood. She couldn't spare even an hour to sit with me because it might interfere with her carefully curated positive energy. Over the next few days, I waited. Every time the elevator dinged on my floor, I looked toward the door hoping to see Rachel's familiar face. Every time my phone buzzed, I thought maybe she'd changed her mind. But the only visitors I got were a few colleagues from school and my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who brought me homemade cookies and stayed for 2 hours just talking about her garden. The nurses started to notice. They'd ask if I was expecting anyone, and I'd make excuses for Rachel. "She's really busy at work, I'd say. She'll be here soon." But after a week, even I stopped believing my own lies. The discharge planner, Marcus Thompson, was a kind man in his 50s who'd probably seen every family dynamic imaginable. He sat down next to my bed one afternoon and gently asked if I had family support at home. That's when I broke down and told him everything. About Rachel's refusal to visit, about her excuse that hospitals were too depressing, about how she'd managed to make my accident all about her and her emotional needs. Marcus listened without judgment, nodding in understanding. He'd seen it before, he said. Sometimes the people we expect to show up don't, and sometimes the people we least expect become our greatest allies. He was right about that. Emily Watson, Rachel's own best friend, showed up unexpectedly on my second week in the hospital. She looked embarrassed and awkward as she explained that she'd heard about my accident through mutual friends, not from Rachel. Emily brought flowers and magazines and stayed for 3 hours, catching me up on neighborhood gossip and making me laugh for the first time since the accident. When she was getting ready to leave, Emily hesitated at the door. She turned back to me with a concerned expression and said something that made my blood run cold. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything okay between you and Rachel? She's been posting constantly on social media about spa days and shopping, trips and fancy dinners, but she's never mentioned your accident. Not once. People are starting to ask me what's going on. That night, I did something I probably shouldn't have done, but pain and loneliness make you do desperate things." I opened Rachel's Instagram account and scrolled through her recent posts. What I saw there felt like another accident, another impact that knocked the wind out of me completely. Photo after photo of Rachel living her best life. Rachel at an upscale restaurant with the caption, "Treating myself to some midweek self-care, because life is too short for anything but happiness." Rachel getting a massage with the caption, "Sometimes you have to eliminate negative energy and focus on your own wellness." Rachel at a charity gala with the caption, "Surrounded by positive people doing positive things for our community." All of these posts were from the past 2 weeks. While I was learning to use a walker and crying myself to sleep from pain, Rachel was living it up and posting about eliminating negative energy. The irony wasn't lost on me that her own sister's suffering was apparently the negative energy she was so determined to avoid. But the post that really broke my heart was from just 2 days earlier. It was a photo of Rachel at the Phoenix Country Club with a group of her wealthy friends, all of them dressed in designer clothes and holding champagne glasses. The caption read, "Grateful for my tribe of strong, successful women who lift each other up. Life is so much better when you surround yourself with people who inspire positivity and growth." I stared at that photo for a long time, studying Rachel's bright smile and perfectly styled hair. She looked radiant, glowing with health and happiness. Meanwhile, I was lying in a hospital bed with unwashed hair and bruises covering half my body, apparently too depressing to deserve even a 5-minute visit from my own sister. That's when something shifted inside me. The hurt and disappointment began to transform into something harder, something more focused. I realized that Rachel had made a choice. She'd chosen her image, her mood, her social status over family loyalty. She'd decided that my suffering wasn't worth her time or energy. But what she didn't realize was that she'd also made a choice about what kind of sister relationship we were going to have going forward. I started keeping a journal, not for therapy, though the nurses encouraged journaling as part of emotional recovery, but for documentation. I wrote down every day that passed without a visit from Rachel. I screenshot her social media posts with their timestamps, creating a digital record of exactly what she was doing instead of visiting her injured sister. I saved the cheerful text messages she sent asking how I was holding up, but never offering to actually come see for herself. Dr. Chen noticed the change in my demeanor during one of her evening rounds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'd gone from sad and defeated to quietly determined, and she asked if something had shifted in my support system. In a way, I told her, yes. I'd realized that I couldn't count on the support I thought I had, so I was learning to build something different. Physical therapy was brutal, but it gave me something to focus on besides Rachel's abandonment. My therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Janet, pushed me harder than I thought possible. Some days I cried from the pain, but I kept going, because every step I took was a step closer to getting out of that hospital and reclaiming my life. During those long weeks of recovery, I had plenty of time to think and plan. I thought about what Rachel valued most: her reputation, her social standing, her image as a successful, caring person in the community. She served on charity boards, hosted fundraising events, and prided herself on being seen as someone who lifted others up. Her entire identity was built around being perceived as a good person who made positive contributions to society. I also had time to reconnect with old friends who I'd lost touch with over the years. One of them was Lisa Rodriguez, my college roommate who'd gone on to become a lawyer specializing in family law and personal injury cases. Lisa came to visit me during my 5th week in the hospital, and we spent hours catching up on life, careers, and relationships. When I told Lisa about Rachel's behavior, her expression grew serious. As someone who dealt with family dynamics professionally, she'd seen how crisis often revealed people's true character. She also mentioned something interesting about public perception and reputation, how quickly things could change when people's true behavior came to light. Lisa brought up a case she'd handled where a prominent community member's charitable image had been destroyed when it came out that he'd abandoned his elderly parents in their time of need. The story had spread through social media, and despite his attempts at damage control, his reputation never recovered. "People don't forgive easily when it comes to family abandonment," she said, especially when someone presents themselves as caring and community-minded. That conversation planted a seed in my mind. Rachel had built her entire professional and social identity around being a positive, supportive person who lifted others up. But what would happen if people knew the truth about how she'd treated her own sister? What would happen to her carefully curated image if her community found out that she'd considered her sister's suffering too depressing to deal with? I didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't want to hurt Rachel physically or destroy her life out of spite. But I did want accountability. I wanted her to face consequences for her choices. And most importantly, I wanted her to understand what it felt like to have your support system disappear when you needed it most. The plan began to form slowly, methodically, during those quiet hospital hours when I was supposed to be resting. It wasn't about anger anymore, though the anger was certainly there. It was about justice, about showing Rachel that actions have consequences, even when those actions are abandonment and emotional neglect. I started by reaching out to mutual acquaintances, people who knew both Rachel and me through family connections or social circles. I didn't badmouth Rachel or tell them sob stories. I simply mentioned casually that I'd been in the hospital for several weeks and was surprised by who had and hadn't come to visit. People filled in the blanks themselves, especially when they realized that Rachel, my only sibling, hadn't been among my visitors. Emily Watson became an unexpected ally in this process, though she didn't know she was helping with anything more than keeping me company. During her visits, she'd mention things Rachel was doing, places she was going, events she was attending. All while I was still in the hospital, still learning to walk again, still facing months of recovery ahead. The contrast was stark, and Emily began to see it too. She started asking more pointed questions about Rachel's absence, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. Emily had always looked up to Rachel, had always seen her as the successful, put-together friend who had everything figured out. But this situation was making her question what she thought she knew about Rachel's character. By my 6th week in the hospital, I was walking with assistance and making good progress in physical therapy. The doctors were talking about discharge, planning, about transitioning to outpatient care and eventually returning home. But I wasn't the same person who'd been brought in after that accident. The experience had changed me, hardened me in some ways, but also clarified what really mattered and what I was willing to tolerate from the people in my life. Rachel had made her choice. She'd chosen her comfort over my suffering, her image over family loyalty, her social calendar over sisterly support. Now it was time for her to live with the consequences of that choice, and for me to show her exactly what it felt like to have your world become a little more depressing when the people you count on decide you're not worth their time. The discharge papers felt heavier than they should have as I signed my name with a hand that still trembled slightly from the medication. 6 weeks in Desert Valley Medical Center had given me plenty of time to think, to plan, and to realize exactly what kind of person my sister Rachel really was underneath all that polished exterior. Dr. Chen reviewed my care instructions one final time, her voice professional but warm as she explained the next phase of my recovery. Home care would involve a visiting nurse 3 times a week, continued physical therapy sessions at Sunny Acres, rehabilitation center, and a gradual return to normal activities over the next 4 months. The social worker, Marcus Thompson, had arranged for a temporary wheelchair ramp to be installed at my house and had connected me with local support services for people recovering from serious injuries. It was more support than my own sister had provided, and these were complete strangers who were being paid to help me. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had an entire team of medical professionals invested in my recovery, while Rachel couldn't even manage a 15-minute visit to see how I was doing. As I gathered my belongings, mostly get-well cards from students and colleagues, I noticed how few personal items I actually had. No flowers from family members, no care packages from my sister, nothing that indicated I had someone who loved me waiting at home. Emily Watson had offered to drive me home from the hospital, another kindness that highlighted Rachel's absence. As we loaded my few possessions into Emily's car, she mentioned that she'd been trying to reach Rachel all week to let her know about my discharge date. Apparently, Rachel had been unreachable, her phone going straight to voicemail, her assistant at the marketing firm claiming she was in back-to-back meetings and couldn't be disturbed. The drive home through familiar Phoenix streets felt surreal after weeks of staring at hospital walls. The desert landscape looked different somehow, more vivid and immediate. Emily kept up a steady stream of conversation, filling me in on neighborhood news and asking careful questions about my recovery timeline. She was being so thoughtful, so present, that it made Rachel's absence even more glaring by comparison. When we pulled into my driveway in Scottsdale, I was surprised to see that someone had been maintaining my yard. The grass was trimmed, the flowers were watered, and my mailbox wasn't overflowing. For a moment, I wondered if Rachel had arranged for this care, if maybe she'd been helping in ways I didn't know about. But Emily quickly solved that mystery by mentioning that several neighbors had been taking turns keeping up with basic maintenance. Mrs. Patterson from next door had organized the whole thing, apparently. Even my elderly neighbor had shown more consideration for my well-being than my own sister. The realization settled in my chest like a cold weight as Emily helped me navigate the wheelchair ramp that had been installed while I was hospitalized. Everything about coming home should have felt warm and welcoming, but instead it felt hollow, empty of the family support that should have been there. Inside, the house smelled stale and unused, despite the neighbors' care of the exterior. Mail was stacked neatly on the kitchen counter, bills and advertisements mixed with get-well cards from students and their parents. I flipped through the cards while Emily made tea, reading messages from 8-year-olds who'd drawn pictures of me getting better, and parents who expressed genuine concern for my recovery. Children had shown more emotional maturity than my 34-year-old sister. That evening, after Emily left with promises to check on me the next day, I sat in my living room and really processed my new reality. The walker stood nearby, a constant reminder of how much my life had changed. But it wasn't just the physical limitations that felt different. Something fundamental had shifted in how I understood relationships, loyalty, and what I was willing to accept from people who claimed to love me. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through Rachel's recent social media posts, a habit that had become both painful and informative during my hospital stay. Her most recent update was from that very afternoon, a photo of her at some trendy restaurant in downtown Phoenix with the caption, "Celebrating another successful campaign launch with my amazing team. So grateful for people who bring positive energy into my life." The timestamp showed she'd posted it just 2 hours after I'd been discharged from the hospital. She'd been celebrating while I was learning how to navigate my own front steps with a walker. She'd been toasting her professional success while I was coming home to an empty house with no family support. The disconnect was so complete, so absolute, that it almost felt like we were living in different universes rather than the same city. But what struck me most was the language she consistently used in her posts. Words like positive energy, uplifting people, and grateful for my support system. She'd built an entire online persona around being someone who valued relationships and emotional support, while simultaneously abandoning her own sister during the most difficult period of her life. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Over the next few days, I established a new routine centered around recovery and gradually increasing independence. The visiting nurse, a kind woman named Patricia, came by 3 times a week to check my incisions and monitor my progress. Physical therapy sessions at Sunny Acres were challenging but encouraging, and I could feel my strength slowly returning. But the emotional healing was more complicated. Friends and colleagues continued to stop by with meals and encouragement. My principal, Mr. Davidson, visited twice to discuss my eventual return to teaching and to assure me that my job would be waiting when I was ready. Students had made a giant banner that read, "Get well soon, Ms. Mitchell," and covered it with handprints and drawings. The outpouring of support from my school community was overwhelming and genuine. Yet through all of this genuine care from friends, colleagues, and even acquaintances, Rachel remained conspicuously absent. She'd sent exactly 2 text messages since my discharge, one asking if I'd made it home safely, and another saying she hoped I was feeling more positive now that I was out of the hospital. Both messages felt perfunctory, like obligation checkboxes rather than genuine concern. The "feeling more positive" comment particularly stung because it revealed so much about how Rachel viewed my situation. In her mind, my hospitalization hadn't been a serious medical crisis requiring family support. It had been a temporary bout of negativity that I needed to get over. The fact that I'd nearly died, that I was facing months of painful recovery, that I'd needed emotional support during the scariest time of my life, none of that registered as legitimate need in Rachel's worldview. During my second week at home, Emily started visiting more frequently, and our conversations grew more honest. She'd been friends with Rachel for over 10 years, and my situation was clearly troubling her. One afternoon, as we sat on my back patio watching the sunset paint the desert mountains purple and gold, Emily finally voiced what had been bothering her. She told me about a conversation she'd had with Rachel the week before, when she'd mentioned visiting me in the hospital. Rachel's response had been telling. She'd said that hospitals made her uncomfortable, that she didn't understand why people insisted on dwelling on negative situations, and that I would probably prefer space to focus on getting better rather than entertaining visitors. Emily had been shocked by the callousness of the response, especially since Rachel knew how isolated and scared I'd been. But what really disturbed Emily was Rachel's complete lack of curiosity about my condition or recovery. She hadn't asked how I was doing, what my prognosis was, or whether I needed anything. Instead, she'd changed the subject to her work projects and upcoming social events. It was as if my accident and hospitalization were minor inconveniences that she was choosing to ignore, rather than genuine crises requiring her attention. Emily's observations confirmed what I'd already suspected. Rachel's absence wasn't due to being too busy or too overwhelmed to visit. It was a deliberate choice based on her own comfort and priorities. She'd decided that my suffering was incompatible with her desired emotional state, so she'd simply opted out of dealing with it entirely. The realization was both heartbreaking and clarifying. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and began documenting everything that had happened, not for therapy or personal processing, but for a specific purpose. I created a detailed timeline of my accident, hospitalization, and recovery, noting every instance where Rachel had chosen other activities over visiting or supporting me. I screenshot her social media posts with their timestamps, creating a clear record of what she'd been doing instead of being there for family. But I also began reaching out more intentionally to the community connections that Rachel valued so much. I started with the charity organizations where she served on boards and the social groups where she'd built her reputation as a caring, community-minded person. I didn't gossip or complain. I simply shared my story when people asked how I was doing after my accident. The Phoenix Women's Professional Network, where Rachel was particularly active, had sent me a beautiful flower arrangement while I was hospitalized. When the president of the organization called to check on my recovery, I mentioned how surprised I'd been by which people had visited me during my hospital stay and which hadn't. I didn't name names, but the conversation naturally led to discussions about family support during crisis and how sometimes the people closest to us can be the most disappointing. Similar conversations began happening with other members of Rachel's social and professional circles. People would ask about my recovery, express sympathy for what I'd been through, and often comment on how lucky I was to have family support during such a difficult time. When I gently corrected that assumption, explaining that my sister had been too busy to visit during my 6-week hospital stay, the reactions were uniformly shocked and concerned. These weren't malicious conversations or deliberate attempts to damage Rachel's reputation. They were honest discussions about a genuinely difficult situation that had revealed disappointing truths about family dynamics. But the cumulative effect was that people in Rachel's carefully cultivated social network were beginning to see a different side of her character than the one she presented publicly. Meanwhile, Rachel remained oblivious to these shifting perceptions. Her social media presence continued to showcase her active social life, professional successes, and commitment to community involvement. She posted photos from charity events with captions about the importance of supporting people in need, apparently unaware of the irony given her treatment of her own sister. She shared inspirational quotes about family and loyalty while continuing to avoid any actual family responsibilities. The disconnect between Rachel's public persona and her private behavior was becoming more apparent to people who knew us both. Emily mentioned that several mutual friends had started asking her questions about Rachel's absence from my recovery process. The Phoenix social scene was smaller than people realized, and word was beginning to spread that something was off about how Rachel had handled her sister's medical crisis. But I wasn't content to simply let gossip do the work. I wanted Rachel to face real consequences for her choices, not just social awkwardness, but actual impacts on the things she cared about most: her reputation, her professional standing, her carefully constructed image as a caring and supportive person. All of it was built on a foundation of lies that I was uniquely positioned to expose. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 weeks after my discharge, I received an invitation that made my heart race with possibility. The Phoenix Community Foundation, where Rachel served on the board of directors, was hosting their annual gala honoring people who'd made significant contributions to supporting others in crisis. Rachel had been instrumental in organizing the event and was scheduled to give a speech about the importance of community support during difficult times. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt like the universe was handing me exactly what I needed. Rachel was going to stand in front of Phoenix's social and professional elite, talking about supporting people in crisis, while her own sister had received zero support from her during the biggest crisis of her life. The hypocrisy was so blatant, so complete, that exposing it would require very little effort on my part. I RSVP'd for the gala, noting that I would need wheelchair-accessible seating due to my ongoing recovery from a serious accident. The foundation's event coordinator was incredibly accommodating, expressing sympathy for my situation, and ensuring that I would have everything I needed to attend comfortably. Their genuine care and consideration provided yet another contrast to Rachel's indifference. As the date of the gala approached, I felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with vengeance and everything to do with accountability. Rachel had made choices about what kind of sister she wanted to be, what kind of person she wanted to be, and now she was going to face the natural consequences of those choices. Not through my vindictive actions, but through the simple truth being revealed to the community she cared so much about impressing. The evening would mark the beginning of Rachel learning what it felt like when your support system disappeared, when people you counted on decided you weren't worth their time and energy, when your carefully constructed world started feeling a little more depressing because the people around you finally saw who you really were underneath all the positive messaging and community involvement. Everything was falling into place exactly as it should, and for the first time since my accident, I felt like I was back in control of my own story. The conversation with Dr. Martinez happened 3 days after I'd returned home from the hospital, during what was supposed to be a routine follow-up call about my medication schedule. Dr. Martinez had been my attending physician during the final weeks of my hospital stay, and she'd grown concerned about what she diplomatically called my limited family support structure during recovery. She'd noticed that while I had plenty of visitors from school and the community, there was one glaring absence that she felt professionally obligated to address. As a physician who'd specialized in trauma recovery for over 15 years, Dr. Martinez had seen every possible family dynamic play out in hospital rooms. She'd witnessed devoted family members who never left their loved one's bedside, and she'd seen families torn apart by the stress of serious medical crises. But she'd rarely encountered a situation quite like mine, where a patient's only sibling simply refused to engage with the recovery process at all. During our phone conversation, Dr. Martinez asked careful questions about my home support system and whether I felt emotionally prepared for the challenges ahead. When I explained that my sister had been too busy with work commitments to visit during my 6-week hospital stay, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Dr. Martinez asked a question that caught me off guard. Had I considered that Rachel's absence might be affecting not just my emotional recovery, but also my physical healing process? She explained that patients with strong family support systems consistently showed better outcomes in terms of pain management, physical therapy compliance, and overall recovery timelines. The psychological stress of feeling abandoned during vulnerability could actually slow the body's healing processes and increase the risk of complications. In essence, Rachel's decision to prioritize her emotional comfort over my needs wasn't just cruel, it was potentially dangerous to my health. This medical perspective on Rachel's abandonment added a new dimension to my understanding of what she'd done. It wasn't just emotional neglect or family drama that could be resolved with time and forgiveness. Her choices had potentially compromised my physical recovery and put my health at risk during the most critical period of healing. The implications were staggering and made her behavior seem even more inexcusable than I'd previously realized. Dr. Martinez also mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She said that in her experience, family members who abandoned loved ones during medical crises rarely limited their neglect to just one situation. People who found excuses to avoid hospitals and recovery support typically demonstrated the same patterns of self-preservation when faced with any challenging family circumstances. Elder care, terminal illnesses, mental health crises, they all became situations that were too depressing or too demanding for people like Rachel to handle. The conversation forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about my sister that I'd been avoiding. This wasn't just about my accident or her current life circumstances. This was about who Rachel fundamentally was as a person when faced with other people's genuine needs. The accident had simply revealed her true character, rather than creating new flaws, and that character was far more selfish and unreliable than I'd ever wanted to acknowledge. After ending the call with Dr. Martinez, I sat in my kitchen staring, at the stack of get-well cards from students and colleagues, thinking about the stark contrast between their genuine care and Rachel's calculated indifference. 8-year-old children had shown more emotional maturity and compassion than my 34-year-old sister. The realization was both heartbreaking and clarifying in ways that changed how I understood our entire relationship history. I began thinking back through other times when Rachel had faced opportunities to provide support or put someone else's needs ahead of her own comfort. The patterns had always been there, but I'd made excuses for them or rationalized them away because acknowledging them would have meant accepting that my sister wasn't the person I wanted her to be. Our mother's final illness, our father's struggles with depression after retirement, even smaller family crises over the years, Rachel had consistently found ways to minimize her involvement while maintaining plausible explanations for her absence. During our mother's battle with lung cancer 3 years earlier, Rachel had visited the hospital exactly twice in 4 months, claiming that her work schedule was too demanding to allow for more frequent visits. She'd contributed financially to medical expenses, but she'd avoided the day-to-day emotional labor of sitting with someone who was dying. I'd convinced myself at the time that people grieved differently, that Rachel was processing the situation in her own way, but now I could see the pattern clearly. When our father had gone through a severe depression following his forced early retirement, Rachel had suggested that he needed professional help rather than family support, effectively removing herself from any responsibility for his emotional well-being. She'd researched therapists and sent information, but she'd avoided spending time with him during his darkest period because his sadness made her uncomfortable. Again, I'd made excuses for her behavior, telling myself that she was just trying to ensure he got the best possible care. The truth was that Rachel had spent our entire adult lives finding sophisticated ways to avoid dealing with other people's pain, suffering, or genuine needs. She was perfectly willing to engage with family during celebrations, achievements, and happy occasions. But the moment someone needed actual support during difficulty, she disappeared behind walls of professional obligations, emotional boundaries, and concern for her own mental health. My accident had simply been the most extreme example of a lifelong pattern, the moment when her selfishness became so obvious that even her usual rationalizations couldn't disguise it. She'd abandoned her sister in a hospital bed because caring for someone in crisis conflicted with her desired emotional state and social calendar. It was the logical conclusion of decades of choosing her own comfort over family responsibility. This realization was devastating, but also liberating in unexpected ways. It meant that I could stop hoping for Rachel to become someone she'd never been and start dealing with who she actually was. It also meant that exposing her true character wasn't vindictive or cruel, it was simply accurate. The community that trusted her with leadership positions and looked to her as an example of compassion deserved to know who they were really dealing with. The Phoenix Women's Professional Network meeting the following Tuesday provided the perfect opportunity to begin sharing my story in strategic ways. The organization had sent flowers during my hospitalization, and several members had reached out individually to express concern and offer support. When I attended my first meeting since the accident, using a walker and still visibly recovering, the response was overwhelmingly warm and supportive. During the informal networking portion of the evening, conversations naturally turned to my recovery process and how I was managing the challenges of healing from such a serious injury. People asked thoughtful questions about physical therapy, home care, and the emotional aspects of recovery from trauma. When they expressed admiration for how well I seemed to be handling everything, I mentioned how surprised I'd been to discover which people had shown up to support me and which hadn't. One woman, Catherine Morrison, who served on several boards, with Rachel, commented on how fortunate I was to have such a supportive family during my recovery. She mentioned that Rachel had always spoken so warmly about our close relationship and how much family meant to her. The opening was perfect for a gentle correction that revealed the truth without seeming bitter or vindictive. I explained that while I'd received incredible support from friends, colleagues, and even acquaintances, family support had been surprisingly limited. When Catherine looked confused and asked for clarification, I simply stated the facts. Rachel had not visited me once during my 6-week hospital stay, had not helped with my transition home, and had been too busy with social and professional commitments to provide any meaningful assistance during my recovery. The shock on Catherine's face was immediate and obvious. She knew Rachel well enough to understand that this wasn't just a scheduling conflict or misunderstanding. It was a deliberate choice to prioritize other things over family responsibility. Catherine had seen Rachel's social media posts during the same period, the constant updates about dinners, events, and professional celebrations that clearly demonstrated where her priorities had been during my crisis. Catherine wasn't the only person at the meeting who had this reaction. As word spread through the room that Rachel had essentially abandoned her sister during a serious medical crisis, the response was uniformly shocked and concerned. These were professional women who understood work pressures and social obligations, but they also understood that some things took precedence over everything else, and family medical emergencies were definitely in that category. The conversations that evening planted seeds that would grow into something much larger over the following weeks. Catherine and others began reaching out to mutual acquaintances, not to gossip, but to verify what they'd heard and to understand how someone they'd respected and worked with could behave so callously toward family. The questions and discussions spread through Phoenix's professional and social networks like ripples in a pond, each conversation adding to the growing awareness that Rachel's public persona might not match her private character. Emily Watson confirmed this shift in perception during her next visit to my house. She'd been getting questions from mutual friends about Rachel's absence during my recovery, and some of those friends had started sharing their own observations about Rachel's behavior in other situations. Patterns were emerging that painted a picture of someone who was skilled at appearing caring and supportive while actually being remarkably self-centered and unreliable when real support was needed. One friend mentioned that Rachel had canceled last minute on helping with a charity event when something more appealing came up. Another recalled Rachel making excuses to avoid visiting a mutual friend who was going through a difficult divorce. Yet another remembered Rachel's minimal involvement during their mother's funeral arrangements, despite being the only family member in a position to help with the logistics and emotional support their father had needed. These individual incidents had seemed like isolated disappointments at the time, but viewed together they revealed a clear pattern of Rachel prioritizing her own comfort and convenience over other people's genuine needs. My situation had been so extreme that it forced people to reconsider their previous experiences with Rachel and recognize the selfishness that had always been there, but had been camouflaged by her charm and professional success. The shift in community perception was happening organically, driven by people's natural revulsion at learning that someone they'd trusted and admired had abandoned family during a medical crisis. I wasn't actively campaigning against Rachel or spreading malicious gossip. I was simply telling the truth about my experience when people asked. But the truth was damning enough on its own to seriously damage the reputation Rachel had spent years building. Meanwhile, Rachel remained oblivious to these changing perceptions. Her social media presence continued to showcase her active social life and professional achievements, with no acknowledgement of family responsibilities or awareness that people were beginning to question her character. She posted photos from charity events with captions about the importance of supporting people in need, apparently unaware of the irony given her recent abandonment of her own sister. The disconnect between Rachel's public messaging and her private behavior was becoming more obvious to people who knew both of us, and those people were sharing their observations with others who might not have known the full story. The Phoenix social and professional scene was smaller and more interconnected than Rachel realized, and word was spreading that there was something seriously wrong with how she'd handled her sister's medical crisis. But I wanted more than just social disapproval and damaged reputation. I wanted Rachel to experience real consequences for her choices, not just awkward conversations at cocktail parties, but actual impacts on the things she cared about most. Her position on various boards, her professional relationships, her standing in the community, all of it was built on the assumption that she was someone who could be trusted to prioritize important responsibilities over personal convenience. The upcoming gala at the Phoenix Community Foundation represented the perfect opportunity to challenge that assumption in the most public and impactful way possible. Rachel would be speaking to hundreds of community leaders about the importance of supporting people during crises, while her own sister sat in the audience as living proof that Rachel's words were empty rhetoric rather than genuine beliefs she lived by. The irony was so perfect, so complete, that it almost felt like divine intervention rather than mere coincidence. Rachel had volunteered to give a speech about community support during difficult times, apparently without considering how that message would be received by people who knew she'd abandoned her own family during exactly that kind of situation. Her ego and obliviousness had led her directly into a trap of her own making. Lisa Rodriguez, my lawyer friend from college, had agreed to attend the gala with me as both emotional support and witness to whatever unfolded that evening. Lisa's legal background made her particularly interested in the ethical implications of Rachel's behavior, especially given her positions of trust and responsibility in various charitable organizations. From a professional perspective, Lisa believed that people in leadership roles with nonprofits should be held to higher standards when it came to living the values they claim to represent. During our planning conversations, Lisa helped me understand the broader implications of Rachel's hypocrisy beyond just family dynamics. Charitable organizations depended on public trust and confidence in their leadership, and that trust could be seriously damaged when board members were revealed to be hypocrites who didn't practice what they preached. Rachel's abandonment of family during crisis directly contradicted the mission of every organization she was involved with, and that contradiction needed to be exposed for the sake of those organizations' integrity. Lisa also pointed out that Rachel's behavior represented a form of fraud, not legal fraud that could be prosecuted, but moral fraud that deceived people about her character and values. The community had made decisions about trusting Rachel with leadership responsibilities based on incomplete and inaccurate information about who she really was. They deserved to know the truth, so they could make informed choices about whether to continue supporting her involvement in charitable work. The legal perspective on Rachel's behavior added weight to my conviction that exposing her hypocrisy was not just personally satisfying but ethically necessary. This wasn't about revenge or family drama. It was about ensuring that people who claimed to care about supporting others during crisis were actually capable of providing that support when it was needed. Rachel had proven that she wasn't capable of meeting that standard, and the community needed to know that before giving her additional opportunities to disappoint people who were counting on her. As the date of the gala approached, I felt increasingly confident that I was doing the right thing for the right reasons. Rachel had made choices about what kind of person she wanted to be and what kind of sister she was willing to be. Now she was going to face the natural consequences of those choices, not through my vindictive actions, but through the simple truth being revealed to people who had the right to know who they were really dealing with when they interacted with her professionally and socially. The stage was set for an evening that would either force Rachel to acknowledge and account for her behavior or reveal to the entire community just how deep her capacity for self-deception and rationalization really went. Either outcome would be satisfying, because either way, the truth would finally be known by the people whose opinions Rachel valued most. The rehabilitation center at Sunny Acres had become my second home over the past month, a place where I was slowly rebuilding not just my physical strength but my understanding of what genuine support looked like. Janet, my physical therapist, had an unusual background that made her perspective particularly valuable during this period of recovery and planning. Before becoming a physical therapist, she'd worked as a social worker specializing in family crisis intervention, which meant she'd seen every possible variation of how families responded when one member needed extensive support. During our sessions, as I worked through increasingly challenging exercises designed to restore my mobility and strength, Janet would share observations about family dynamics that helped me process my own situation with Rachel. She'd noticed that patients with absent or unreliable family members often developed stronger support networks among friends and colleagues, as if the betrayal forced them to build better relationships with people who actually deserved their trust and investment. Janet had also observed that family members who abandoned relatives during medical crises typically followed predictable patterns of behavior. They would often attempt to rewrite history after the crisis passed, claiming that they'd been more involved than they actually were, or suggesting that their absence had been requested by the patient. They might also try to reinsert themselves into the person's life once the difficult recovery period ended, expecting to resume their previous relationship without addressing their abandonment. These insights helped me prepare for what I suspected would be Rachel's eventual attempts to normalize our relationship once my recovery was complete, and she no longer had to deal with the inconvenience of my medical needs. She would probably expect to return to our previous dynamic as if nothing had happened, perhaps even expecting gratitude for the minimal support she'd provided through text messages and brief phone calls. But Janet's most important observation was about the difference between forgiveness and accountability. She'd seen too many patients excuse their family members' abandonment in the name of forgiveness, essentially enabling the same behavior to continue in future crises. True healing, she argued, required honest acknowledgement of what had happened and real consequences for people who had proven themselves unreliable during vulnerable times. This perspective aligned perfectly with my growing conviction that exposing Rachel's behavior wasn't about revenge, but about ensuring accountability for someone who had failed spectacularly in her family responsibilities, while simultaneously building a public reputation around caring for others. The community needed to know who Rachel really was, so they could make informed decisions about trusting her with leadership roles in organizations dedicated to supporting people during difficult times. The social dynamics at Sunny Acres also provided interesting insights into how people responded to learning about family abandonment during medical crises. Other patients and their family members naturally formed a supportive community during the long hours of rehabilitation appointments, and conversations often turned to recovery experiences and family support systems. When people learned that my sister hadn't visited me once during my 6-week hospital stay, their reactions were uniformly shocked and concerned. These weren't people who knew Rachel personally or had any investment in her reputation. They were simply decent human beings who understood that family members were supposed to show up during medical emergencies. Their spontaneous reactions of disbelief and disapproval reinforced my understanding that Rachel's behavior was genuinely inexcusable, rather than just disappointing from my personal perspective as her sister. One particularly insightful conversation happened with Margaret Chen, an elderly woman whose hip replacement recovery coincided with my therapy schedule. Margaret had raised 4 children as a single mother and had strong opinions about family responsibility and loyalty. When she learned about Rachel's absence during my crisis, she didn't mince words about what she thought of such behavior. Margaret explained that in her generation, family obligation during illness or injury wasn't negotiable regardless of personal convenience or emotional comfort. People showed up because that's what family members did, period. The idea that someone would abandon a sibling in a hospital bed because visiting was too depressing was completely foreign to her understanding of how decent people behaved toward the people they claimed to love. But Margaret also shared wisdom about dealing with family members who proved themselves unreliable during crisis. She'd had a sister who disappeared during their mother's final illness, making excuses about being too emotionally fragile to handle watching someone die. Margaret had learned the hard way that people who failed you during your darkest moments would likely fail you again in future crises, unless they faced real consequences for their abandonment. Margaret's advice was simple but powerful. Make sure the community knows who they're really dealing with when they consider this person for positions of trust and responsibility. People had a right to know whether someone who claimed to care about supporting others would actually follow through when support was needed, especially if they were making decisions about charitable giving or volunteer leadership roles. These conversations with Margaret and other patients at Sunny Acres helped me understand that my situation with Rachel wasn't just personal family drama, but part of a larger social issue about accountability and truth in community leadership. People who built their identities around helping others needed to be held to the standards they claimed to represent, and the community had a right to know when those standards were just performative rather than genuine. The timing of my recovery also meant that I was becoming increasingly mobile and independent, just as Phoenix's social season was reaching its peak. Spring in the desert brought a flurry of charitable events, fundraising galas, and community gatherings, where Rachel would be highly visible in her various leadership roles. Each of these events represented an opportunity for truth-telling that could reach different segments of the community she cared so much about impressing. Emily Watson had become an invaluable source of information about Rachel's social calendar and public commitments during this period. As Rachel's friend and frequent companion at charitable events, Emily was positioned to observe firsthand how Rachel presented herself to the community and what messages she promoted about caring for others. The cognitive dissonance between Rachel's public persona and her private behavior was becoming increasingly difficult for Emily to ignore. During one of our weekly coffee meetings, Emily shared details about a recent fundraising lunch for the Phoenix Children's Hospital, where Rachel had given an impromptu speech about the importance of supporting families during medical crises. She'd spoken passionately about how community care could make the difference between despair and hope for people facing serious health challenges, receiving enthusiastic applause from an audience that had no idea she'd abandoned her own sister during exactly such a crisis. Emily's discomfort with Rachel's hypocrisy was becoming more obvious with each passing week. She'd begun asking pointed questions about Rachel's absence during my recovery, questions that Rachel deflected with vague references to respecting my privacy and allowing me space to heal. But Emily knew enough about my actual experience to recognize these explanations as sophisticated lies designed to hide Rachel's real motivations for staying away. The strain in Rachel and Emily's friendship was becoming apparent to others in their social circle as well. People had begun noticing that Emily seemed less enthusiastic about Rachel's various projects and more willing to question her decisions and priorities. When mutual friends asked Emily about the tension, she found herself in the awkward position of either lying to protect Rachel or sharing uncomfortable truths about her friend's character. Emily's evolving perspective on Rachel was particularly significant because she'd been one of Rachel's most vocal supporters and admirers for over a decade. If someone who'd known Rachel that long and had that much investment in their friendship was beginning to question her character, it suggested that the facade Rachel had maintained was starting to crack under the weight of her recent behavior. The cracks were becoming visible in other relationships as well. Rachel's assistant at the marketing firm had mentioned to Emily that Rachel seemed increasingly defensive about her family relationships and had become irritated when colleagues asked about my recovery. Several board members from Rachel's various charitable organizations had expressed concern privately about her emotional state and commitment level, noting that she seemed distracted and less engaged than usual. These signs of mounting pressure suggested that Rachel was beginning to sense that her behavior during my crisis had damaged her reputation in ways she didn't fully understand yet. She was experiencing the early stages of social and professional consequences without having enough information to address them effectively, which was likely increasing her anxiety and defensiveness. The situation was developing exactly as I'd hoped it would, with truth gradually emerging through natural social processes rather than through any vindictive actions on my part. People were drawing their own conclusions about Rachel's character, based on the facts of her behavior, and those conclusions were influencing how they interacted with her professionally and socially. But I wanted to accelerate this process and ensure that the truth reached the broadest possible audience in the most impactful way. The Phoenix Community Foundation Gala represented the perfect opportunity to achieve that goal, bringing together hundreds of community leaders in a setting where Rachel's hypocrisy would be impossible to ignore or rationalize away. My preparation For the gala involved more than just planning what to wear or arranging transportation with Emily. I'd spent considerable time researching the other honorees who would be recognized that evening, people who had genuinely sacrificed their own comfort and convenience to support others during difficult times. Their stories provided powerful contrasts to Rachel's behavior and would help highlight the hypocrisy of her speaking about community support while having failed to support her own family. I'd also prepared responses to the questions I expected to receive about my recovery and family support during the crisis. The key was to remain factual and unemotional while sharing information that would help people understand the full context of Rachel's speech about supporting others. I wasn't planning to attack Rachel directly or create a dramatic confrontation, but I was prepared to answer honestly when people asked about my experience. Lisa Rodriguez had helped me think through the legal and ethical implications of different approaches to revealing Rachel's hypocrisy at the gala. As a lawyer, she understood the importance of staying within appropriate boundaries while still ensuring that the truth was known. Her advice was to focus on my own experience rather than making judgments about Rachel's character, letting people draw their own conclusions from the facts I presented. Lisa would be attending the gala as my guest and witness, providing both emotional support and professional perspective on whatever unfolded that evening. Her presence would also lend credibility to my account of events, since she'd observed Rachel's behavior throughout my recovery and could confirm the accuracy of my descriptions if anyone questioned them. The anticipation building toward the gala felt different from simple revenge planning. This was about accountability, about ensuring that someone who had failed spectacularly in her family responsibilities couldn't continue to deceive the community, about her character and values. Rachel had made choices about what kind of person she wanted to be, and now she was going to face the natural consequences of those choices in the most public and appropriate setting possible. The irony that Rachel had volunteered to speak about supporting people during crises, apparently without considering how that message would be received by people who knew about her abandonment of her own sister, suggested a level of self-deception that was almost impressive in its completeness. She'd walked directly into a situation where her words and actions would be compared in the most unflattering possible way, and she'd done it entirely to herself. As the evening approached, I felt calm and confident about what was going to happen. This wasn't about destroying Rachel out of spite or wounded feelings. It was about revealing truth to a community that deserved to know who they were really dealing with when they made decisions about leadership and trust. Rachel's hypocrisy had created this situation, and now she would have to live with the consequences of her choices in the most public and appropriate way possible. The revelation came during what should have been a routine appointment with my primary care physician, Dr. Samantha Wells, who had been coordinating my overall recovery care since my discharge from Desert Valley Medical Center. Dr. Wells had requested a comprehensive follow-up to assess my progress and discuss the long-term implications of my injuries. But the conversation took an unexpected turn when she began asking detailed questions about my emotional and psychological recovery from the trauma. As someone who had treated hundreds of accident victims over her 20-year career, Dr. Wells understood that physical healing was only part of the recovery process. The psychological impact of serious accidents often lingered long after bones healed and mobility returned, particularly when patients lacked adequate emotional support during their most vulnerable period. She'd been concerned about my family support structure since my initial discharge, and now she wanted to address those concerns directly. Dr. Wells explained that she'd reviewed my entire medical file, including notes from nurses, social workers, and therapists who had observed my situation during hospitalization and recovery. What emerged from their collective observations was a clear picture of someone who had been essentially abandoned by their primary family member during a serious medical crisis, despite having an extensive support network of friends, colleagues, and even acquaintances who had stepped up to provide care and encouragement. The medical implications of this abandonment were more serious than I'd realized. Dr. Wells cited recent research showing that patients with inadequate family support during recovery from serious injuries experienced higher rates of depression, anxiety, chronic pain, and delayed healing. The stress of feeling abandoned during vulnerability could actually interfere with the body's natural healing processes and increase the risk of long-term complications. In essence, Rachel's decision to avoid supporting me during my recovery hadn't just been emotionally cruel, it had potentially compromised my physical health and delayed my healing process. Dr. Wells was careful to frame this as an observation, rather than a diagnosis, but the implication was clear. Rachel's abandonment had caused measurable harm beyond just hurt feelings or family disappointment. This medical perspective on Rachel's behavior added a new dimension to my understanding of what she'd done and why accountability was so important. This wasn't just about family loyalty or personal disappointment. It was about someone in a position of community trust who had proven themselves capable of causing actual harm through their selfishness and unreliability. People needed to know what Rachel was capable of before they trusted her with additional opportunities to disappoint or abandon people who were counting on her support. Dr. Wells also shared observations about family dynamics that helped me understand Rachel's behavior in a broader context. She'd noticed that family members who abandoned relatives during medical crises often exhibited similar patterns of behavior in other stressful situations. The inability to prioritize other people's needs over their own emotional comfort typically wasn't limited to medical emergencies, but extended to any situation where genuine support was required. This insight helped explain the pattern I'd been noticing in Rachel's behavior throughout our adult lives. Her absence during our mother's final illness, her minimal involvement during our father's depression, her tendency to disappear whenever family members needed emotional support. All of it reflected the same fundamental selfishness that had led to her abandoning me during my accident recovery. The medical crisis had simply been the most extreme example of a lifelong pattern. Dr. Wells recommended that I consider speaking with a counselor who specialized in family trauma and abandonment issues, not because she thought I was handling my recovery poorly, but because she believed that professional support could help me process the full implications of what Rachel's behavior revealed about our relationship. She also suggested that I might benefit from connecting with support groups for people who had experienced family abandonment during medical crises. The idea of joining a support group initially felt unnecessary, since I had such strong support from friends and colleagues. But Dr. Wells explained that there was something uniquely devastating about being abandoned by family during vulnerability. That was different from other types of relationship disappointments. People who had experienced similar betrayals could offer perspectives and coping strategies that even the most caring friends might not be able to provide. That afternoon, I researched support groups in the Phoenix area and was surprised to discover how many existed specifically for people who had been abandoned by family members during medical crises. The prevalence of such groups suggested that Rachel's behavior, while shocking to me personally, was unfortunately not as rare as I'd hoped. There were apparently enough people dealing with similar betrayals to support multiple ongoing therapy groups focused specifically on this issue. I decided to attend a meeting of one group that met weekly at St. Mary's Community Center, not far from my house. The group was facilitated by a licensed clinical social worker named David Kim, who had extensive experience working with people who had been traumatized by family abandonment during vulnerable periods. When I called to inquire about attending, he explained that the group included people who had been abandoned during various types of medical crises, from cancer treatment to mental health emergencies to accident recovery. My first meeting with the support group was both heartbreaking and validating in ways I hadn't expected. The room held 12 people ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s, and each had a story of family abandonment during their darkest moments. Some had been left alone during cancer treatment, others during psychiatric hospitalizations, still others during recovery from serious surgeries or accidents. What struck me most about the group was how similar all of our experiences were, despite the different medical circumstances that had created our vulnerabilities. In almost every case, The family member who had abandoned them was someone who presented themselves publicly as caring and supportive, often someone involved in charitable work or community service. The disconnect between their public personas and their private behavior was a consistent theme across all of our stories. One group member, Patricia, shared that her daughter had abandoned her during chemotherapy treatment while simultaneously organizing a charity walk for cancer research at her workplace. Another member, Robert, described how his brother had refused to visit during his psychiatric hospitalization while serving on the board of a mental health advocacy organization. The hypocrisy was so consistent across different situations that it seemed to represent a specific type of personality disorder rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment. David Kim explained that this pattern was actually well documented in psychological literature. People who built their identities around being seen as helpful and caring often struggled with genuine caregiving because real support was messy, emotionally demanding, and incompatible with maintaining a positive self-image. It was easier to write checks to charities or organize fundraising events than to sit with someone in pain and provide actual emotional support during crisis. This psychological framework helped me understand Rachel's behavior in clinical terms rather than just emotional ones. Her abandonment of me during my recovery wasn't necessarily a conscious choice to be cruel, but rather a predictable response from someone whose identity was built around maintaining a positive emotional state and avoiding anything that might threaten her carefully constructed self-image as a successful, caring person. Understanding the psychology behind Rachel's behavior didn't excuse it, but it did help me develop a more strategic approach to holding her accountable. If her actions were driven by a need to maintain her public image as someone who cared about others, then the most effective consequence would be exposing the contradiction between that image and her actual behavior when caring was required. The support group also provided valuable perspectives on the importance of public accountability for people who had abandoned family during medical crises. Several group members shared stories about family members who had faced professional or social consequences when their behavior became known in their communities, and how those consequences had either led to genuine reflection and behavior change or revealed even deeper levels of selfishness and manipulation. David Kim emphasized that public accountability served multiple purposes beyond just satisfying the abandoned person's need for justice. It protected other potential victims by revealing patterns of unreliability in people who held positions of trust and responsibility. It also validated the experiences of people who had been abandoned by confirming that their treatment was genuinely unacceptable rather than just personally disappointing. These insights reinforced my conviction that exposing Rachel's behavior at the upcoming gala was not just personally satisfying, but socially responsible. The community that trusted her with leadership roles in charitable organizations deserved to know that she was capable of abandoning people during their most vulnerable moments, especially when she was simultaneously building her reputation around supporting others during difficult times. The group meetings also helped me prepare emotionally for the potential backlash I might face when Rachel's behavior became public knowledge. David Kim warned that people who were exposed for family abandonment often responded with manipulation, tactics designed to shift blame back to their victims. They might claim that their absence had been requested, that they had provided support in ways that weren't visible to others, or that the abandoned person was being vindictive or mentally unstable. These manipulation tactics were so predictable that David had developed a standard set of responses for group members who faced such attacks. The key was to remain factual and unemotional, focusing on specific behaviors and timelines rather than engaging with attempts to reframe the narrative or shift responsibility. Documentation was crucial, which was why I'd been so diligent about keeping records of Rachel's absence and her social media posts during my recovery period. The support group also provided practical advice about dealing with mutual friends and family members who might pressure me to forgive and forget Rachel's behavior in the name of family harmony. Several group members had faced similar pressure from people who were uncomfortable with conflict and preferred to sweep family problems under the rug rather than address them directly. David Kim explained that this pressure to forgive prematurely was often more about the comfort of bystanders than the healing of the person who had been abandoned. People who hadn't experienced family abandonment during crisis often couldn't understand the depth of the betrayal and might minimize its significance in order to restore their own sense that families were reliable and supportive institutions. The group helped me develop responses to such pressure that honored my own need for accountability while avoiding unnecessary conflict with well-meaning friends and relatives. The goal was to maintain my boundaries around what kind of relationship I was willing to have with Rachel going forward while not alienating people who genuinely cared about both of us, but didn't fully understand the situation. As the date of the Phoenix Community Foundation Gala approached, I felt increasingly prepared for whatever might unfold that evening. The Phoenix Community Foundation Gala was everything I had imagined it would be and more. The Grand Ballroom at the Phoenician Resort glowed with warm lighting and elegant decorations, filled with the city's most influential business leaders, politicians, and philanthropists. Women in designer gowns moved gracefully between tables, while men in perfectly tailored tuxedos discussed deals and donations over champagne. This was Rachel's world, the arena where she had built her reputation as a caring, community-minded professional who deserved trust and admiration. I arrived with Lisa Rodriguez, both of us dressed appropriately for the occasion, but not trying to compete with the obvious wealth and status on display. My goal wasn't to blend in seamlessly, but rather to be present and visible as someone who clearly belonged in this community, while also obviously recovering from serious medical trauma. The walker I still needed for longer distances served as a subtle but constant reminder of recent crisis and vulnerability. Emily Watson met us at the entrance, looking uncomfortable in a way that immediately told me she'd been dreading this evening. Over the past weeks, Emily had been caught between her loyalty to Rachel and her growing understanding of how inexcusably Rachel had behaved during my recovery. Tonight would force Emily to watch Rachel speak publicly about supporting people. During crisis, while sitting next to the sister Rachel had abandoned during exactly such a situation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the full story, and that number was growing larger each day as word spread through Phoenix's interconnected social and professional networks. Emily had confirmed that several board members from various charitable organizations had heard about Rachel's absence during my hospitalization, and were beginning to question whether someone who couldn't support their own family should be trusted with leadership roles in organizations dedicated to helping others. Rachel spotted me almost immediately after I entered the ballroom, her face showing a brief flash of surprise before settling into her practiced social smile. She approached our table with the confident stride of someone who owned every room. She entered, but I could see tension around her eyes that suggested she wasn't as comfortable as she wanted to appear. For the first time since my accident, Rachel looked like someone who understood that her behavior might have consequences beyond her immediate family. Her greeting was perfectly polite and socially appropriate, asking about my recovery and expressing pleasure that I felt well enough to attend such an important community event. But there was something calculated about her words, as if she were performing for the other people at our table rather than actually communicating with me. She mentioned how proud she was that I was supporting the foundation's important work, conveniently ignoring the fact that I'd been supporting their mission long before tonight and had never needed her encouragement to care about helping others. The dinner conversation provided multiple opportunities for subtle truth-telling that helped people understand the full context of Rachel's upcoming speech. When tablemates asked about my recovery process and expressed sympathy for what I'd been through, I mentioned how surprised I'd been to discover which people showed up to provide support and which didn't. The contrast between my extensive visitor list from friends and colleagues and the complete absence of my only sibling became obvious without me having to explicitly criticize Rachel. One particularly perceptive woman, Margaret Hoffman, who served on the hospital's board of directors, asked directly about family support during my crisis. She'd seen enough medical situations to understand that family involvement was crucial for both physical and emotional recovery, and she seemed genuinely puzzled when I explained that my sister had been too busy with professional and social commitments to visit during my 6-week hospital stay. Margaret's reaction was immediate and telling. She knew Rachel by reputation and had worked with her on several charitable initiatives. But learning about her abandonment of family during a medical emergency clearly changed Margaret's perception of Rachel's character. The conversation that followed involved careful questions about Rachel's explanations for her absence and whether there might have been misunderstandings or communication problems that accounted for the situation. My responses were factual and unemotional, focusing on specific timelines and documented events rather than emotional interpretations or personal grievances. I mentioned Rachel's social media posts during my hospitalization, her attendance at various social and professional events while I was learning to walk again, and her stated reason that hospitals were too depressing for her to handle visiting. The facts spoke for themselves without requiring any editorial commentary from me. Other people at our table were clearly listening to this conversation with growing interest and concern. Several of them had worked with Rachel in professional contexts and had trusted her with significant responsibilities based on their belief that she was someone who prioritized helping others over her own convenience. Learning that she'd abandoned her own sister during a serious medical crisis was forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about her character and reliability. The moment of truth arrived when Rachel was introduced as the evening's keynote speaker. She looked radiant as she approached the podium, wearing an elegant black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her smile was confident and warm as she began speaking about the importance of community support during life's most difficult moments. Her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being listened to and respected. Rachel's speech was beautifully crafted and professionally delivered, hitting all the right emotional notes about compassion, sacrifice, and the moral obligation to help others during their darkest hours. She spoke passionately about how crisis revealed people's true character and how the measure of a community was determined by how it treated its most vulnerable members. She quoted statistics about the healing power of emotional support and the devastating effects of isolation during medical emergencies. The irony was so complete, so absolutely perfect, that it almost felt surreal to be sitting in that ballroom listening to Rachel lecture hundreds of community leaders about values she had spectacularly failed to demonstrate in her own life. Every word of her speech could have been applied directly to her treatment of me during my recovery, and the contrast between her public message and her private behavior was becoming obvious to anyone who knew the full story. But Rachel's most devastating moment came when she began discussing specific examples of community members who had made extraordinary sacrifices to support others during medical crises. She told stories about people who had rearranged their entire lives to provide care for friends and neighbors, who had put their own comfort aside to ensure that no one faced serious illness or injury alone. The audience responded with appreciative murmurs and spontaneous applause for these examples of genuine compassion and selflessness. As Rachel continued describing the characteristics of people who truly supported others during crisis, she was unknowingly providing a perfect checklist of everything she had failed to do during my hospitalization and recovery. She spoke about the importance of showing up physically rather than just offering thoughts and prayers from a distance. She emphasized that real support meant prioritizing someone else's needs over your own schedule and emotional comfort. She described how genuine caring required sustained commitment rather than occasional gestures or token expressions of concern. The audience was clearly moved by Rachel's presentation, but I could see growing discomfort among the people at my table who understood the context of her words. Emily looked increasingly pale as the speech continued, apparently realizing for the first time just how completely Rachel's public message contradicted her private behavior. Margaret Hoffman was taking notes in a way that suggested she was documenting specific quotes that she might want to reference in future conversations about Rachel's suitability for leadership positions. When Rachel finished her speech to enthusiastic applause, She returned to our table with the satisfied expression of someone who believed she had delivered an important message effectively. But the atmosphere at our table had shifted noticeably during her presentation, and several people seemed to be studying her with new interest and concern. The cognitive dissonance between her inspiring words about supporting others and her documented abandonment of her own sister was becoming impossible to ignore. The networking portion of the evening provided opportunities for more direct conversations about the contradiction between Rachel's public persona and her private behavior. As people moved between tables and mingled throughout the ballroom, word began spreading about the irony of Rachel's speech being delivered while her sister, who she'd abandoned during a medical crisis, sat in the audience as living proof that her inspiring words were empty rhetoric. Margaret Hoffman was particularly effective in sharing this information with other hospital board members and healthcare professionals who understood the serious implications of family abandonment during medical recovery. These were people who had seen firsthand how crucial emotional support was for healing, and they were appalled to learn that someone who spoke so eloquently about community care had failed to provide basic family support during a genuine emergency. The conversations weren't malicious or gossipy, but rather concerned discussions about the integrity and reliability of someone who held multiple leadership positions in charitable organizations. People were genuinely troubled by the disconnect between Rachel's public advocacy for supporting people in crisis and her documented failure to support her own family member during exactly such a situation. By the end of the evening, it was clear that Rachel's reputation had suffered serious and probably irreparable damage. The contrast between her inspiring speech and her actual behavior had been too stark for people to rationalize away or excuse as a misunderstanding. She had voluntarily placed herself in a position where her words and actions were compared in the most unflattering possible way, and the comparison had revealed her to be a hypocrite whose public persona was built on values she didn't actually practice. Rachel seemed to sense that something had shifted during the evening, but she appeared uncertain about exactly what had happened or how to address it. Her usual confident social demeanor had been replaced by a nervous energy that suggested she was beginning to understand that her behavior during my recovery had consequences she hadn't anticipated. The protective bubble of rationalization and self-deception that had allowed her to avoid confronting her own selfishness was finally beginning to crack. Over the following weeks, the impact of the gala became increasingly apparent as Rachel began facing real consequences for her choices. Several charitable organizations quietly removed her from leadership positions, citing concerns about her commitment to their missions. Professional relationships that had taken years to build began deteriorating as word spread about her abandonment of family during crisis. Social invitations became less frequent as people questioned whether they wanted to be associated with someone whose public values were so obviously disconnected from her private behavior. The most satisfying aspect of watching Rachel's world crumble wasn't the revenge or vindication, but rather the restoration of truth and accountability in a community that had been deceived about her character. People deserved to know who they were really dealing with when they made decisions about trust and responsibility, and now they had that information. Rachel's hypocrisy had been exposed not through vindictive attacks, but through the simple truth being revealed in the most appropriate possible context. Meanwhile, my own recovery continued to progress both physically and emotionally. The support group at St. Mary's Community Center had become an important part of my healing process, connecting me with other people who understood the unique trauma of family abandonment during vulnerability. Through their shared experiences and insights, I was learning to build a life that didn't depend on the unreliable people who had disappointed me during my darkest moments. I also began volunteering with the hospital's patient advocacy program, helping other people navigate family dynamics during medical crises and connecting them with resources for building stronger support networks. My experience with Rachel's abandonment had taught me valuable lessons about identifying genuine caring versus performative compassion, and I wanted to help other patients avoid the isolation and betrayal I had experienced. The transformation from victim to advocate felt like the most meaningful outcome of everything I had been through. Rachel's betrayal had forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, and to build relationships based on genuine mutual support rather than family obligation or social convenience. In trying to make my life more depressing, Rachel had actually helped me create a more authentic and fulfilling existence, surrounded by people who truly cared about my well-being. Rachel eventually attempted to rebuild her reputation and repair the damage to her social and professional standing, but the truth about her character had been too thoroughly revealed for her to simply return to her previous status in the community. People had seen who she really was when supporting others became inconvenient, and that knowledge couldn't be erased through better public relations or renewed charitable involvement. The final irony was that Rachel's attempts to protect her emotional comfort by avoiding my medical crisis had ultimately caused her far more distress and difficulty than simply visiting her sister in the hospital would have required. Her selfishness had backfired spectacularly, creating exactly the kind of depressing situation she had been so determined to avoid, except now she was the one experiencing isolation and disappointment instead of me. The lesson was clear. People who abandon others during their most vulnerable moments will eventually face the consequences of their choices, and those consequences often involve experiencing the same abandonment and isolation they inflicted on others. Rachel had made her life depressing through her own selfishness, and now she would have to live with the results of prioritizing her comfort over family loyalty and genuine compassion. The aftermath of the gala unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche, gathering momentum with each passing day as the truth about Rachel's character spread through Phoenix's tightly connected professional and social networks. What had started as whispered conversations between concerned board members quickly evolved into a systematic reevaluation of Rachel's fitness for the leadership positions she had accumulated over the years. The community that had once celebrated her as a shining example of compassionate leadership was now grappling with the uncomfortable reality that they had been deceived by someone whose public persona bore no resemblance to her private character. The first concrete consequence came exactly 1 week after the gala, when Margaret Hoffman called to inform me that the hospital's board of directors had voted unanimously to remove Rachel from her position on their patient advocacy committee. Margaret explained that the board simply couldn't reconcile Rachel's passionate advocacy for family support during medical crises with her documented abandonment of her own sister during exactly such a situation. The hypocrisy was too glaring, too fundamental to overlook or excuse as a momentary lapse in judgment. Margaret also shared that several other board members had begun reviewing Rachel's past contributions to the committee with fresh eyes, looking for signs they might have missed about her true character. What they discovered was a pattern of surface-level involvement that looked impressive on paper, but lacked the depth of genuine commitment they had previously assumed. Rachel had been skilled at attending meetings, making strategic donations, and delivering inspiring speeches, but she had consistently avoided the more demanding aspects of patient advocacy that required sustained emotional investment and personal sacrifice. The Phoenix Women's Professional Network followed suit 3 days later, quietly removing Rachel from their Leadership Development Committee after several members expressed concerns about her suitability as a mentor for young professionals entering the field. Catherine Morrison, who had been one of the first people to learn about Rachel's abandonment of me during my recovery, explained that the organization simply couldn't in good conscience promote someone as a role model who had failed so spectacularly at demonstrating the values they claimed to represent. Catherine mentioned that the decision hadn't been easy, given Rachel's long history with the organization and her previous contributions to their programs. But the fundamental contradiction between Rachel's public advocacy for supporting women during career challenges and her private abandonment of family during personal crisis was impossible to ignore. How could they recommend that young women look to Rachel for guidance on balancing professional success with personal responsibility when she had proven incapable of meeting even the most basic family obligations during a genuine emergency? Emily Watson became an unexpected ally during this period, though her support came at considerable personal cost. The cognitive dissonance between her decade-long friendship with Rachel and the undeniable evidence of Rachel's selfishness had finally become too much for Emily to bear. During a tearful conversation at my kitchen table, Emily admitted that she had been making excuses for Rachel's behavior for years, overlooking patterns of self-centeredness and emotional manipulation that had become obvious only in hindsight. Emily shared stories I had never heard about Rachel's behavior during other people's difficulties, incidents that painted a consistent picture of someone who disappeared whenever supporting others became emotionally demanding or socially inconvenient. There was the time Rachel had skipped a friend's mother's funeral because she had tickets to a wine tasting event. The occasion when she had backed out of helping another friend move because she decided the process would be too stressful and depressing. The pattern of promising support during difficult times but finding reasons to withdraw when actual follow-through was required. These revelations helped me understand that my situation hadn't been an isolated incident, but rather the most extreme example of Rachel's lifelong pattern of prioritizing her own comfort over other people's genuine needs. Emily's willingness to acknowledge these patterns and share them with mutual friends accelerated the community's understanding of Rachel's true character, providing additional context that made her abandonment of me during my medical crisis seem like a predictable outcome rather than a shocking aberration. The professional consequences began multiplying as Rachel's marketing firm started facing uncomfortable questions from clients who had chosen the company, partly based on Rachel's reputation for ethical leadership and community involvement. Several high-profile accounts specifically mentioned concerns about working with someone whose personal values were so dramatically disconnected from their public messaging. The firm's managing partner, David Chen, called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation and its potential impact on their business relationships. David had initially been skeptical of the rumors circulating about Rachel's behavior, assuming they were exaggerated or taken out of context. But when he conducted his own investigation and spoke directly with people who had witnessed Rachel's abandonment of me during my recovery, he was forced to confront the reality that one of his senior executives had seriously damaged both her own reputation and the firm's credibility. The marketing industry depended heavily on trust and authenticity, qualities that Rachel had proven herself incapable of demonstrating when they mattered most. The conversation between David and Rachel apparently didn't go well, based on Emily's report of what she had heard through mutual professional connections. Rachel had reportedly tried to minimize the situation, claiming that family dynamics were private matters that shouldn't influence professional relationships. She had suggested that people were overreacting to a personal disagreement and that her work performance should be evaluated separately from her family relationships. But David and the other partners weren't buying these rationalizations. They understood that someone who could abandon their own sister during a medical emergency while simultaneously building their career around helping others solve their problems represented a fundamental liability to the firm's reputation and client relationships. Trust was the foundation of their business, and Rachel had proven that her trustworthiness was purely situational and self-serving. The social consequences were perhaps even more devastating than the professional ones, as Rachel found herself increasingly isolated from the community connections that had defined her identity for years. Invitations to charity events became less frequent, and when she did attend social gatherings, conversations grew awkward as people struggled to reconcile their previous admiration for her with their new understanding of her character. The cognitive dissonance was too great for most people to navigate comfortably, leading them to simply avoid situations where they might have to interact with her directly. Rachel's attempts to rehabilitate her reputation through increased charitable giving and volunteer work backfired spectacularly, as people interpreted these efforts as manipulative attempts to buy back the respect she had forfeited through her behavior. Every new donation or volunteer commitment was viewed with suspicion rather than appreciation, as community members questioned whether Rachel was genuinely committed to helping others or simply trying to repair her damaged image through performative acts of charity. The situation reached a breaking point when Rachel appeared at my house unannounced on a Saturday morning, approximately 6 weeks after the gala. I was working in my garden, something that had become both physical therapy and emotional healing for me during my recovery, when I heard her car pull into my driveway. She looked haggard and desperate in a way I had never seen before, her usually perfect appearance showing signs of stress and sleepless nights. Rachel's opening words revealed the depth of her self-deception and manipulation, as she immediately tried to frame the conversation around how my vindictive behavior had damaged her reputation and career prospects. She accused me of orchestrating a campaign against her, of poisoning people's minds with exaggerated stories about our family dynamics, of being unable to move past my accident and recovery in a healthy way. The blame shifting was so complete, so absurd, that it actually strengthened my resolve rather than making me question my choices. I let Rachel finish her accusations and self-justifications before responding with the calm factuality that had served me well throughout this entire process. I reminded her that I had never actively campaigned against her or spread malicious gossip about her character. I had simply told the truth when people asked about my recovery experience and family support during my medical crisis. If that truth was damaging to her reputation, the problem wasn't with my honesty, but with her behavior. Rachel's response revealed the depth of her narcissism and inability to accept responsibility for her actions. She insisted that her absence during my hospitalization had been reasonable given her work pressures and emotional sensitivities. She claimed that I had been demanding too much support and that healthy people needed to maintain boundaries around other people's medical issues. She suggested that my expectations of family support had been unrealistic and that she had actually done me a favor by giving me space to heal without feeling obligated to entertain visitors. The conversation became increasingly surreal, as Rachel tried to rewrite history in ways that painted herself as the victim of my unreasonable expectations, rather than acknowledging her abandonment of family during crisis. She seemed genuinely unable to understand why people were so disturbed by her behavior, suggesting that the community's negative reaction was evidence of their inability to understand modern approaches to family relationships and self-care. But the most revealing moment came when Rachel asked what it would take for me to fix this situation and help repair her damaged reputation. She offered to make financial contributions to my medical expenses, to publicly acknowledge that she should have visited more often during my recovery, even to attend family counseling sessions if that would help convince people that our relationship was back on track. The transactional nature of her thinking was breathtaking in its complete absence of genuine remorse or understanding. I explained to Rachel that there was no fixing the situation, because the problem wasn't a misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication or public relations. The problem was that she had revealed her true character during my moment of greatest vulnerability, and that character was incompatible with the leadership roles and community trust she had previously enjoyed. People now knew who she really was when supporting others became inconvenient, and that knowledge couldn't be erased through belated gestures or strategic damage control. Rachel's final attempt at manipulation involved threatening to tell people that I was suffering from psychological problems related to my accident, that my campaign against her was evidence of trauma-induced paranoia or vindictiveness that should be pitied rather than taken seriously. The threat was so desperate and pathetic that it actually made me feel sorry for her. Not because she was being treated unfairly, but because she was so fundamentally broken as a human being that she couldn't comprehend why abandoning family during medical crisis was morally unacceptable. I told Rachel that she was welcome to tell people whatever she wanted about my mental state or motivations, but that the facts of her behavior during my recovery were documented and witnessed by too many people to be dismissed as the delusions of a traumatized accident victim. Her absence from my hospital room, her social media posts during my recovery period, her documented refusal to provide support because hospitals were too depressing, all of it was verifiable reality rather than subjective interpretation. After Rachel left that day, I felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. I had seen my sister's true character fully revealed, without the protective layers of rationalization and social performance that had previously obscured it. She was exactly who she had always been, someone whose caring and compassion extended only as far as her own comfort and convenience would allow. The accident had simply created circumstances that made this fundamental selfishness impossible to hide or excuse. The months that followed brought continued confirmation that the community's reassessment of Rachel's character was both thorough and permanent. She eventually left Phoenix entirely, taking a position with a marketing firm in Denver where her reputation hadn't preceded her. Emily heard through professional connections that Rachel was struggling to rebuild her career and social connections, apparently having learned nothing from her experience about the importance of genuine character versus performative virtue. Meanwhile, my own life continued to improve in ways that had nothing to do with Rachel's downfall and everything to do with the authentic relationships and meaningful work that had emerged from my recovery experience. The patient advocacy program at the hospital had become a central focus of my volunteer work, helping other people navigate family dynamics during medical crises and connecting them with resources for building stronger support networks. The support group at St. Mary's Community Center had evolved into something more than just therapeutic sessions, becoming a community of people who understood the unique challenges of rebuilding life after family abandonment during vulnerability. Several group members had become close friends who provided the kind of reliable, unconditional support that I had mistakenly thought I could expect from blood relatives. These relationships were based on mutual respect and genuine caring, rather than obligation or social convention. My teaching career had also taken on new dimensions as I incorporated lessons about resilience, authentic relationships, and personal integrity into my work with students. The experience of surviving both physical trauma and family betrayal had given me insights about character and perseverance that enriched my ability to guide young people through their own challenges and disappointments. The most unexpected gift from this entire experience was the clarity it had provided about what really mattered in life and relationships. Rachel's abandonment had forced me to distinguish between people who genuinely cared about my well-being and those who were simply going through the motions of social connection. The result was a smaller but infinitely more reliable social circle of people who had proven themselves capable of showing up during difficult times rather than disappearing when support became emotionally demanding. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that Rachel had actually done me a favor by revealing her true character so completely during my medical crisis. If she had maintained her facade of caring sisterhood while providing minimal but plausible support, I might have continued investing emotional energy in a relationship that was fundamentally one-sided and unreliable. Her complete abandonment had forced me to face reality and build something better in its place. The community's response to learning about Rachel's behavior had also restored my faith in human decency and moral accountability. People had been genuinely appalled by her abandonment of family during crisis, not because they were judgmental or unforgiving, but because they understood that such behavior was fundamentally incompatible with the values that held communities together. Their reaction confirmed that Rachel's selfishness was aberrant rather than normal, and that most people still believed in basic standards of human decency and family loyalty. The final lesson from this experience was about the power of truth and the importance of accountability in maintaining social trust. Rachel's downfall hadn't resulted from vindictive attacks or malicious gossip, but from the simple exposure of accurate information about her character and behavior. The community had made informed decisions about whether to continue trusting her with leadership responsibilities once they understood who she really was, and those decisions had been both rational and appropriate. In trying to make my life depressing, by abandoning me during my darkest hour, Rachel had ultimately made her own life depressing through the natural consequences of her selfishness and moral failure. The irony was perfect, and the justice was complete. Not because I had orchestrated her downfall, but because the truth about her character had finally been revealed to the people whose respect and trust she valued most. Sometimes the best revenge really was living well, building authentic relationships, and allowing people to face the consequences of their own choices. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.